When the bridge into Alder Creek went down, the town lost more than a railroad. It lost its lungs. No flour, no salt, no coffee, no medicine, no wagon road that could stay open once the high snow came. On November 6, 1891, 379 people in a Montana mining camp stood beside an empty depot and kept telling themselves the next freight would come. It did not. 4 miles east of town, the Red Lantern trestle had snapped under a coal train. 12 cars folded into the gorge. The locomotive dropped through the timber frame and landed in the black water below. 2 men died before anyone in Alder Creek even heard the sound. By sunset, the only rail line in or out of town was hanging in splintered pieces over a canyon, and winter was already walking down the mountains. The last freight had arrived 9 days earlier. Flour sacks, salt pork, beans, kerosene, coffee. A few crates of apples already bruising in the cold. The town had counted the shipment the way a man counts breaths after a bad fall. They had enough, they thought, for maybe 6 weeks if everyone behaved carefully. 6 weeks of food. At least 4 months of winter. The math was not frightening because it was complicated. It was frightening because it was simple. There were too many mouths, too little food, and too much snow between Alder Creek and the rest of the world. But 1 mile above the depot, under a widow's kitchen floor, there was another kind of bridge. Not iron, not timber, not built by the railroad. Built in glass. 612 sealed jars sat in the dark beneath Mara Whitcomb's house, stacked on stone shelves her husband had cut before the mine took him. Tomatoes thick as blood, pickled beans, apples packed in syrup, carrots, plums, rabbit meat sealed under clean fat, venison, chokecherry sauce, dried corn, salted mushrooms, everything summer had given her. Kept against the season that took everything back. For 3 years, Alder Creek had laughed at those jars. By January, those jars were the only reason the town would still have children in spring. Mara Whitcomb had not come west to become a warning. She had come west in 1886 with her husband, Caleb, because every newspaper in St. Louis seemed to be printing the same bright lie. Silver was waiting in the mountains, and any man willing to work could dig himself into a better life. Caleb was not a miner at first. He was a wheelwright, a quiet man with wide hands and the patience to make a broken wagon roll again. But mining towns paid better than farms, and Alder Creek needed men who could timber tunnels, fix ore carts, brace hoists, and build what the mine kept breaking. So Caleb took the work, Mara took the house. It was a narrow 2-room cabin on the slope above town, with wind pressing against the walls almost every night, and dust finding its way through every crack in summer. The soil was thin, the water was cold. The growing season was short enough to feel insulting. Still, Mara planted, potatoes first, then beans, then onions. Then a hard row of cabbages that looked half dead until September, and then suddenly tightened into green fists. She had learned the habit from her mother in Missouri, and her mother had learned it from a grandmother who had survived years when a failed harvest meant more than inconvenience. In that older world, putting food by was not a hobby. It was not thrift. It was not feminine fussing. It was survival performed months early. Alder Creek did not see it that way. The town belonged to the railroad and the mine. Every 2 weeks, the freight train came smoking around the bend with flour, meat, nails, lantern oil, seed, fabric, medicine, and whatever small luxuries made a hard place feel briefly civilized. The train made everyone modern. Why spend August sweating over a stove when the company store sold peaches in tins? Why pickle beans when barrel pork came by rail? Why dry apples in the attic when a crate could arrive before the last one was gone? The town had mistaken delivery for security. Mara had not. She dried what she could not boil. She pickled what would sour safely. She sealed fruit in syrup. She smoked rabbit. She packed cooked meat under fat the way older women had done before catalogs and freight schedules made people careless. She saved every jar as though it were a coin. At first Caleb smiled at her seriousness. Then he built her a cold room, not just a cellar, a proper one, dug into the slope where the earth stayed cool, faced with stone, with shelves braced so tightly they did not tremble when winter winds struck the house. He cut a trapdoor into the kitchen floor and fitted a ladder down into the dark. "Looks like you're building a second town down here," he told her once. Mara answered without looking up from the jars. "No, a second road." Caleb laughed then. Later, that sentence would be repeated in Alder Creek like scripture. The mine took Caleb in the spring of 1889. A bad brace failed in the number 3 drift. 3 men were buried. 2 were pulled out by nightfall. Caleb was carried home with his ribs crushed and silver dust still on his shirt. He died before dawn with Mara holding the hand that had built her shelves. After the funeral, people expected her to leave. She was 37, no children, no family in the territory, a house too large for grief and too small for comfort. But Mara stayed, and she kept filling jars. That was when the laughter turned sharp. Silas Klein, the owner of Klein's Mercantile, sold flour to every household in town and debt to half of them. He understood exactly what Mara's cellar meant. A woman who fed herself from her own shelves bought less from his. So he made her a joke before she could become an example. "Mrs. Whitcomb is burying supper under her floor again," he said, one July afternoon while miners leaned against his counter. "If starvation ever learns to read labels, she'll be ready for it." The men laughed. Silas went further. He told people home-sealed jars were dangerous. He told them food kept that long would turn foul. He told them grief had made Mara suspicious of ordinary life. A widow, alone in a house, boiling vegetables and lining them up in the dark like soldiers. It made a good story, and good stories can make a whole town cruel. Mrs. Cora Bell, wife of the mine foreman, refused a jar of apple butter Mara brought when her youngest boy had fever. "We do not eat from cellar glass," Cora said, low enough to sound polite and loud enough for the other women to hear. Mara took the jar back. She did not argue. She had learned something grief teaches quickly. People who have already decided you are foolish do not hear explanations. They only hear proof. So Mara kept the proof underground. By the fall of 1891, the cold room held 612 jars, 14 stone crocks, 3 bins of dried apples, 2 sacks of beans, and enough cured meat to make broth that could stand up on its own. It was not wealth in the way Alder Creek understood wealth. It was not ore, not payroll, not credit at Klein's counter. It was quiet wealth, the kind that did not look powerful until power failed. The Red Lantern trestle fell before the first heavy snow, which made the disaster feel temporary. At first, Alder Creek behaved like a town inconvenienced, not a town trapped. The railroad would send repair crews, the company would arrange wagons. The mine owners would not let a productive camp starve. Surely the world outside would remember them. For 6 days people spoke like that. Then the road scouts returned. They had pushed 12 miles through the eastern pass before drifts forced them back. Ice had taken the switchbacks. 2 mules had gone lame. A wagon could not pass. A sled might get through before the next storm, but not loaded with enough food to matter. Then the railroad telegram arrived at the depot office, carried as far as the broken line, and walked in by a track hand. Repairs deferred until spring thaw. Deferred. Alder Creek learned that a company could write a death sentence with an office word. Mayor Jonas Pike ordered an inventory the same afternoon. Every household listed what it had. Every sack was weighed, every barrel was opened, every private cupboard became a public number. They found flour for 28 days at full ration, beans for 31. Salt pork for less than 3 weeks if shared fairly. Coffee was cut at once. Sugar almost disappeared. Kerosene was guarded as if it were medicine. The mine stopped regular work and put men on wood cutting, hunting, and snow clearing, but the elk had moved lower before the worst weather. Deer tracks vanished into country no hungry man could reach. Rabbits fed a few families, then fewer, then almost none. By Christmas, bread had become a memory with a smell. By New Year's, soup in Alder Creek meant hot water that had once passed near a bone. Hunger changed the town in ways no speech could have done. It made proud men count potato peels. It made mothers lie to children and say they had already eaten. It made the church quieter because singing took strength. It made the schoolhouse close, not because learning had stopped mattering, but because little bodies could not sit upright through a morning on watered broth. The first starvation death was an old Swedish miner named Peter Almgren. He had hidden half ration in a coffee tin and carried it every evening to a widow with 3 children near the livery. When they found him in his bunk, the tin was empty, and his hands were folded on his chest as if he had been trying not to ask for anything. 2 more deaths followed in 9 days. Then a baby died during a storm so loud that no one heard the mother screaming until morning. That was the day Alder Creek stopped, pretending spring was close. Lydia Pike, the mayor's daughter, was 19 and too thin to look 19 anymore. She had been helping with ration ledgers, writing numbers that got smaller each time a cupboard was opened. She knew every line of the town's hunger. She also knew about Mara Whitcomb's cellar. Everyone did. That was the shame of it. They had laughed at it for years, mocked it in stores, refused it at sickbeds, called it poison and madness and grief. Now the memory of those jars sat in every hungry mind like a door no one wanted to knock on. Lydia finally did. She found Mara after Sunday service, when the congregation moved slowly down the church steps, wrapped in blankets and silence. Mara was standing alone beside the frozen horse trough. "Mrs. Whitcomb," Lydia said. Her voice cracked on the name. Mara turned. Lydia tried to keep her eyes up, but hunger had made honesty faster than pride. "The food under your house," she said. "Is it still good?" Mara looked at the girl for a long moment. There are questions that are not really questions. Lydia was not asking whether jars could hold food. She was asking whether people who had been cruel could still be saved by the thing they had despised. Mara's answer was plain. "Yes," Lydia swallowed. "Enough to help, enough to bridge us," Mara said. "Not enough to make us careless." The girl's face broke then. Not into tears exactly. Into relief that hurt too much to come out gently. "My father should ask you," Lydia said. "The town should ask you. The town has been asking for weeks," Mara said. It just used hunger instead of words. That afternoon, Mayor Pike came up the hill with Lydia, Silas Klein, Cora Bell, Reverend Ames, and 6 others chosen because every one of them had once spoken against Mara's cellar. Mara had asked for that, not to punish them, to make them carry the truth back down. She opened the trapdoor in her kitchen. Cold air rose from below, smelling of earth, vinegar, smoke, and apples. One by one, they climbed down the ladder. The lantern showed the shelves. For a moment, no one spoke. The jars were not piled in panic. They were ordered by season and kind. Labels written in Mara's narrow hand marked each one. August tomatoes, September beans, rabbit, winter batch, apples, 1890, venison broth, plum preserve. Rows and rows of sealed food stood in the dark like a town that had been waiting underneath the town. Cora Bell put a hand to her mouth. Silas Klein stared as though he had found his own store, rebuilt beneath a widow's floor. Mara lifted a jar of tomatoes from the shelf. "Watch the lid," she said. She worked the seal open. A small sound came from the jar, not a dramatic sound, just the clean release of something kept properly. Mara held it out. "Smell." No one moved. Then Lydia stepped forward and breathed in. Her eyes closed. "It smells like August." That was the first miracle Alder Creek allowed itself to believe in. Not a miracle from heaven, a miracle from work done before anyone clapped for it. Mara did not hand over the cellar. That was her first rule. Food given without order would become food wasted. Hunger could turn decent people frantic. She knew that. So she ran the cold room like a bridge with weight limits. Children first, then the sick, then the elderly, then workers cutting wood and clearing paths, then every household by count, not status. Her second rule was harder. Every family receiving food had to send someone to learn. Not just watch, learn. How to clean jars, how to boil them, how to pack food hot, how to judge a seal, how to smoke meat until moisture left it, how to dry apples above a stove without scorching them, how to use salt, vinegar, sugar, cool earth, and time as tools, how to throw out a suspect jar no matter how hungry you were. "This is not luck," she told them. "Luck is what people call work after it saves them." The town listened because the town had no strength left for arrogance. Mara opened food carefully. One jar of tomatoes could turn 3 kettles of gray water into soup children would swallow. A handful of dried apples could quiet a room after supper. Meat sealed under fat could become broth with weight to it. Beans, cooked slowly and divided fairly, gave men enough strength to swing axes again. The food did not make Alder Creek comfortable. It made Alder Creek possible. The change was slow, which made it holy in a hard way. Children stopped crying through the night. Old women, who had not stood without help, began sitting near stoves and mending again. Men cutting firewood worked longer before their hands shook. The schoolhouse opened for 2 hours a day, not because the children had enough, but because they had something. The funeral bells stopped ringing. That was the sound people remembered most. The bell not ringing. For 11 weeks, Mara's cellar held the line. 612 jars did not feed 379 people by themselves. The story was never that simple. The jars worked because she stretched them through discipline, because the town kept rationing, because hunters still brought in scraps now and then, because every dried apple and every spoon of preserved broth was used to strengthen what little remained. But without that cellar, the numbers would have finished Alder Creek. Everyone knew it. Silas Klein knew it when his wife drank broth, made from venison he had called dangerous. Cora Bell knew it when her youngest boy ate apple preserve from a jar just like the one she had refused. Mayor Pike knew it when his ration ledger stopped looking like a list of funerals. And Lydia knew it each time she carried a basket down the hill and saw smoke still rising from houses that should have gone cold. The thaw came late. The railroad repair crew reached Red Lantern Gorge on March 14, 1892. They worked in mud and sleet with ropes around their waists because the old trestle had left the canyon walls unstable. 4 days later, the first temporary span took weight. On March 20th, a freight engine crossed into Alder Creek, moving slower than a funeral. The whole town gathered at the depot. When the doors opened, flour sacks came out first, then bacon, coffee, kerosene, medicine. Crates of oranges that looked impossible against the snow. People cried over ordinary supplies. Then, slowly, the crying changed, because every person there understood the train had not saved them. It had arrived after they had already been carried across. In April, when the square finally emerged from snow, Alder Creek held a meeting in front of the church. Not a celebration, a reckoning. Mayor Pike stood on the steps with his hat in both hands. Last summer, he said, this town believed a freight schedule was the same thing as food. No one laughed. We believed rails made us wiser than our mothers. We believed a store shelf was safer than a cellar shelf. We believed Mrs. Whitcomb was wasting her grief in jars. He looked toward Mara, standing near the back, arms folded inside her shawl. When the bridge failed, she had already built another one. Silas Klein spoke next. It cost him something. Everyone saw that. His business had been his pride, and his pride had almost become the town's grave. I called her food poison, he said. I made men laugh at it. I stopped stocking the jars she asked for because I did not want people learning they could need me less. His mouth tightened. My children ate from those jars. My wife is alive because of food I tried to shame out of existence. I have no defense. Cora Bell was crying before she stepped forward. I refused kindness, she said. Not because I knew better, because I wanted to stand above someone. She looked down at her hands. My boy lived on apples from a cellar, I mocked. After that, the town did not need many speeches. Shame had already done its work. Mara climbed the church steps last. She did not look triumphant. Triumph belonged to people who had wanted enemies. Mara had wanted neighbors who were not dead. My mother used to say a pantry is a bridge, she said. Her voice carried cleanly across the square. Not because food is fancy, not because shelves are pretty, because there is always a gap coming between harvest and hunger, between good weather and bad, between what a town believes will hold and what actually holds. She let the silence stretch. You laugh because the bridge I built did not look like a bridge. The crowd was still. It looked like jars. It looked like smoke. It looked like vinegar and salt and work done in hot rooms when nobody was hungry yet. Mara turned toward the mountains. The iron bridge failed in one afternoon. The bridge under my floor took 3 years to build. Then she faced them again. Build your own. That was all. No demand for a statue. No request for repayment. No long sermon about forgiveness. Just a command sharp enough to survive being remembered. Build your own. That summer, Alder Creek changed its hands. Gardens spread wherever soil could be persuaded to hold seed. The mine cut shifts early on certain days, so families could work their plots while light remained. Hunters brought game first to the smokehouses before selling any to the store. Women who had once lowered their voices around Mara now crowded into her kitchen with sleeves rolled and notebooks ready. Men came too, quietly at first, then openly. Hunger had burned the foolishness out of them. Mara taught 3 evenings a week until her voice went rough. She taught how to keep a jar clean enough to trust, how to smoke meat low and slow, how to dry fruit until it bent without weeping, how to pack cabbage and salt until winter would not steal it, how to write dates on every lid because memory becomes generous when people want to believe food is safe. By September, Klein's Mercantile had a new front window. Not lace, not candy, not imported cloth. Jars. Stacks of them. Glass catching the autumn sun. Silas sold them at cost for one full season. Some said guilt made him do it. Others said fear. Mara did not care which, as long as the shelves in town kept filling. By the first frost of 1892, Alder Creek held more than 4,000 jars across its houses and cellars. Not all perfect, not all beautiful, but enough. Enough that when snow shut the pass again, people did not stare at the depot as if salvation had to come on rails. They had bridges under their floors. Mara Whitcomb lived another 26 years in the same house above the depot. Children who had eaten from her cellar grew up and brought their own children to learn what a good seal sounded like. The phrase, "build your bridge," became common in that part of the valley. It meant, fill your shelves before the need arrives. It meant do the boring work while comfort makes you look ridiculous. It meant never confuse a system that usually works with a system that cannot fail. When Mara's hands stiffened and she could no longer lift the heavy kettle, younger women came to her kitchen and did the lifting while she corrected them from a chair. Too much air in that jar. More salt. Mark the date where tired eyes can see it. Do not trust a thing just because you want it to be safe. She remained exact. That was another lesson Alder Creek kept. Survival was not sentiment. It was discipline. In 1917, after Mara died, Lydia Pike found a small carving above the cellar door. Mara had cut it into the wood years earlier, shallow and plain, where only a person reaching for the latch would see. 7 words: build the bridge before the snow. The red lantern trestle was rebuilt twice after that. Once after a flood, once after a fire. Each time, freight stopped. Each time, Alder Creek waited. But it never starved again, because the town had learned that foresight often looks like foolishness until the day foolishness becomes the only road left. The iron bridge failed. The bridge in her cellar held.